Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Dan's Astrology. I'm your host, Dan. Today, you may notice I'm set up in a different room where I have my computer, and I am going to show you the upcoming transits. Today, I'm looking at, in particular, Mars, which has been retrograde in Cancer, is about to station direct. And I thought I'd use my computer to because I wanted to go more into what this Mars retrograde and what this Mars direct station means in context with some um, political charts. Namely, I mean, I've been doing a lot of this in response to the threat of a trade war, threat of annexation, all that kind of fun stuff. And I have to admit that, these are kind of like silly times that we're living in. It's kind of ridiculous that we have to, um, that this is even something that we're looking at. But I appreciate, I think it's like a wonderful thing that I have the opportunity to be using my time creatively, or have the opportunity to learn astrology, to have access to the technology, to be able to record astrology videos. I mean, there's so many things I could be doing with my time, and yet I have this wonderful opportunity to enjoy this whole process of doing it. So just thanks for everybody for supporting me in my astrology journey so far. Anyways, let's get into it. So today I'm sitting down to talk about this Mars Station Direct, and it's the 16th of February. Mars here is retrograde in Cancer, the 17th degree today. So this is the middle decan of Cancer. And as we inch along here, we can see that eventually the slow moving Mars stations at the same degree. So it's barely moving right now. Mars is basically slowing down, parked in the middle of Cancer here at 17 degrees. And at the time of the 24th of February, Mars is stationing direct, and then it will spend the last few days of February in slowly going to direct motion. Around the time we also have a new moon in Pisces. Okay, so you'll also notice at this time Mars in Cancer here is making a trine aspect to Saturn in Pisces. Now, what is Saturn all about? Saturn is the usually stands for the Senex archetype, for old age, infirmity, injury, being senile, being kind of slowness. It's the alchemical lead, so they're kind of a dark and heavy kind of quality. And it also stands for basically the quality of limitation. Often, Saturn and Jupiter are contrasted with each other, as Jupiter being more about growth and expansion, and Saturn about being the limits. And one of the things that we notice around this transit has been the question of border security, the question of the limits of the reach of certain nations, and a sort of the need to redefine one's borders, a kind of assertion of one's boundaries, right? And there's something about Mars and Cancer where you have to consider the meaning of this transit is defined by the fact that Mars, in the traditional system of traditional dignities, Mars does not do well in Cancer. Mars is in its fall in Cancer, right? This is because Mars is the god of war. The god stands for things like aggression, adrenaline, testosterone, this sort of hot-blooded sort of these sort of male. How people talk about how there are the only emotions that men are allowed to express under the hegemonic structure of patriarchal masculinity is anger, frustration, irritability. Men are not allowed to be sad. They're not allowed to express grief. They're not allowed to express yearning or loneliness. They can only be angry, right? There's something about this where Cancer is the sign of the mother, is the sign of the child, is the sign of the moon. The moon stands for these kinds of it stands for the kind of temperamentality of the emotions, the moods, the body, and there's a certain kind of sensitivity or a certain kind of nurturing quality to Cancer where the Mars the warrior is out of place. It's like if you imagine a nursery room where all these babies are nursing at their bottles, and then you got some tough guy like who goes in there like a drill sergeant who starts blowing on his whistle, demanding all these little babies do push-ups or something, or starts yelling at them, calling them pieces of shit or something. It's just not appropriate. It's not the appropriate energy for the appropriate environment. And the mismatch of this energy, of this angry, aggressive, assertive Mars energy in a sign that has more to do with attachment, sentimentality, nurturing, that kind of stuff. It's similar to, let's say, I think you can see the dynamic in this whole thing about I'm biased because I'm a Canadian, but the fact that the Canadian economy is set up, or geographically, we're right beside the America, right? The America is our neighbor, right? It's sort of like in the same way how the planet Earth has the moon as this little thing that orbits the Earth. And we might relate to the moon and ask, what is the moon doing for us, right? Here on Earth, it's a very busy place. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of activity. There's a whole ecosystem of plants and animals and oxygen and water and all these kinds of things. And it's a huge center of activity, the planet Earth, right? And yet we have this thing that orbits it, the moon, which is a rock, right? It's just, there's nothing on it. It doesn't contribute anything. And yet somehow it's bound up in our gravitational orbit, right? And so there's something about like, it maybe some people suggest that the moon contributes to, like the woman's menstrual cycle timing up with the moon cycle, or the tides going around and stuff like this. But it's kind of this thing that it's like as if taking this thing, which is our celestial neighbor, or our, we could treat it as if like the way that I have I have a couple dogs that I look after, a couple cats. There are these things that are attached to us, that are in our gravitational field, but there's a certain kind of thing of like the lunar nature. It's like the way that you would expect a child. You have a certain set of expectations for a child. You don't expect the child is going to be maybe as productive as the adult, right? Unless you have, child labor or something, right? But we've evolved out of that. Like in the same way that, maybe animals, like a dog, like, one of my dogs, like you can have animals that are employed for a purpose. Like they're there to kill rats and kill mice, or to be guard dogs and protect, or else they could just be there as your friendly neighbor, your friendly companion, this being that is there in your orbit, and you don't expect much of them, right? The same way that, if you were a drill sergeant, like if you are a general, it's sort of like you want recruits for your army, and you walked into a children's nursery or a kindergarten, and you tried to, you're go there to recruit child soldiers. You might be barking up the wrong tree. There's something like this where it's like, or like the schoolyard bully, where, it's like picking a mismatched fight or something like that. But there's also, if you consider what's going on in, the state of war today is mainly characterized by these grossly mismatched fights. In the sense that if you look, and I'm not going to take, this goes across the board from whether you're talking about the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. The Ukraine is not a very economically strong country, and it's in a vulnerable position. Currently, the Ukraine spends 30 to 40% of its GDP on defense budget, whereas Russia, has a huge leftover military that it basically inherited from the USSR. It inherited from the Cold War. I don't know. I'm not a military aspect, but the point is, it's a mismatched fight, obviously. And there's also, you could also go and suggest the whole thing between Israel Palestine, also a bit of a mismatched fight. Also involves things like, you know what I'm saying? There's a sense of being overly aggressive with your neighbors. And in this sense, maybe in this sense, we're lucky to be Canadians, in the sense that we may have conflicts with our neighbors. We may have this tension that's come up over the trade war, but it's at least we're not, at least where this tension has a chance to play itself out in the avenue of weaponized capitalism, basically, or weaponized trade policies, rather than actual all-out warfare. But there's something, I'm just suggesting that there's something interesting about this Mars. To me, this is what it resonates with. The fact that these two malefics, Mars being the one that's more aggressive and more hostile and more volatile, in a kind of place where it's not very appropriate for it to be, and it feeling like it just feels like how do you respond to this, right? Like, it feels like it's like a silly situation because it's like a fight where it's not supposed to be, right? And also in that trine aspect to Saturn, there's this sort of, I think there's a re-emphasis on the border security, or the idea to define the boundaries, define the limits. And more recently in the news, the USA, I saw recently, announced they are trying to withdraw from NATO. They're trying to withdraw from being involved with their international role. It's kind of isolationist, right? But there's something about this too, which seems like Mercury is very debilitated right now. Mercury is in detriment and fall in Pisces, and at the time Mars stations direct, Mercury will be in this conjunction, but with Saturn and Neptune in Pisces. And this is all lead up, mind you, to Saturn and Neptune ingressing into Aries, right? But there's something where the J.D. Vance was basically booed off the stage in Munich. Like, the generals basically think J.D. Vance is a joke, and it's like kind of like taking this guy who is like, maybe there's a certain kind of there's a certain kind of milieu, like a certain environment where this guy is kind of like at home, where his message, the words that he speaks meets the right audience. But if you take this guy and put him in Germany, in Munich, like, they don't take him seriously. It's like, it's just this whole mismatch situation that goes with Mars and Cancer, right? So what you're going to see is eventually, after Mars stations direct, we're going to have Mars getting into Leo, but that's not going to happen. Like, Mars isn't going to enter into Leo into April of this year, shortly before 420. But I want to show you a few other things here. First of all, all this talk, this thing about the trade war, the threat of annexation of Canada, had me thinking that I don't actually look a lot at the Canadian national chart. And this is apparently the one that people like to use. It's the what would be considered the equivalent of the America's Sibley chart. This is the 1st of July, 1867. The date or the timing for this is 00 a.m., so midnight in Ottawa, Canada. It's one of the things that I wanted to, I'd just like to compare this to the American chart for a number of reasons. First of all, you will notice that the Canadian chart has a Sun conjunct Uranus, perfectly conjunct at 8 degrees in Cancer, and that is on the IC. So, and it's also in a balsamic phase with the moon in Gemini there. And it's interesting to point this out for a number of reasons, mainly because America also has Sun in Cancer. The Mars retrograde that we've been going through has therefore been transiting the sun placements of both America and Canada. And that also, once we're over this Mars retrograde and we get Mars into Leo, we're going to have Mars transiting Canada's natal Mercury placement. And then also, once we get Canada will have its Mars return once we get Mars in Virgo later on, right? If we compare this to the American chart, one thing you'll notice is that the location of Canada's Sun-Uranus conjunction is at 8 Cancer. The closest planet it's aligned with in the American chart would be Jupiter, which is in a great exalted position in the American chart, right? So which is interesting because this means that we're going to be having a Jupiter in Cancer later this year. America's going to be having a Jupiter return with this nice, lucky, fortunate, exalted Jupiter, and that Canada's Sun and Uranus is conjunct that Jupiter return of the state. And so there's a kind of, I think when I think Jupiter in Cancer, I think of a kind of a very warm, friendly, sentimental relationship that you have with your neighbors, right? Like being a very kind of generous, like having a nice barbecue, and you're not going to be stingy about what you're sharing. So I think there's a part of the archetypal dynamic where Canada and America are very close together, but there's a lot of abundance, a lot of wealth that America shares with Canada. And there's something about the whole political situation where America is feeling stingy, feeling the limits, feeling like running out of how much abundance it has, and this is largely you can see this playing out with the dynamic basically with the Saturn Neptune in Pisces. Interesting to note here that America's natal Neptune is in Virgo, so America is has been going through Neptune opposite Neptune. The Pisces Neptune transit has been opposing the natal Neptune. And, often Neptune, we're talking about this kind of idealistic, hopeful, kind of having faith, it can go in different ways, but there's a kind of salvific kind of quality, right? And so you can see that in a Neptune opposite Neptune transit, there's some kind of the extent to which America can help out is coming under question. One of the things that there's something interesting here, though. If you consider this whole Saturn-Neptune thing playing out, you may notice that where's Canada's natal Neptune placement? It's right there on the ascendant in Aries. And so this means that when Canada, once we have this transit of Saturn and Neptune into Aries, this will also be the Neptune return for Canada. What does this mean? Well, one thing that I noticed was that if you take the US Sibley chart and you animate it and you go by year, so this is 1776. Keep in mind, okay, so let's just go quickly through here. Here it is, the birth of the USA, and you can see Neptune racing through the signs as history rolls by, and we're moving quickly through the 19th century. Once we get here to Neptune in Pisces, we have the 1850s into the 1860s. And here we have Neptune in Aries. This is around the time when Canada was created, right? So you're starting to get the sense here, and you can see here the the Uranus and the Sun conjunction here, so you can sort of get the sense of the. I mean, this isn't perfect, but of the time scale of how Canada is a younger country compared to America, and Canada is only having its Neptune return, but not its Pluto return, right? That America just recently had its Pluto return. So as we keep going here and we approach the 20th century, one thing you'll notice is that America, prior to the world wars, was more isolationist, and then and actually had an attitude of trying to stay out of World War II for a while. And it was only when Pearl Harbor happened that America was drawn into the war, right? And so Pearl Harbor happened in 1941. And if you notice that this was basically shortly after America's Neptune return, right? So, and I think there's something interesting about this because, first of all, how do you define Pearl Harbor? Pearl Harbor was an attack on Hawaii. Hawaii being an island, of course, in the middle of the Pacific that's really not connected to America at all, but it's considered to be one of the states of America, right? And it's way out in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of nowhere. And one of the things that people always like Neptune, in a very basic way, Neptune is the god of the sea, and Neptune often stands for ocean stuff happening. And America, prior to this, was staying out of World War II, but in this moment, there's a naval battle. The attack on Pearl Harbor initiates America coming into World War II, and I honestly, there's a bit of a difficult thing because I think that I'm not a warmonger. I'm not a hawk. I'm not a person who is really that keen on thinking that the future should be defined by more war. That the future should be defined by pressure on all these countries to spend more money on defense and all this kind of stuff. But this is exactly the politics right now, which is basically we're defined by Mars, the god of war, in Cancer, retrograde, about to station direct, in this trine to Saturn, which is running into the limitations, right? Running into the limits of how much you can be generous, how much you can help, all this kind of stuff. And there's something about all this which I feel is astrologically relevant for Canada's Neptune return. I don't think it's going to be the same as a Pearl Harbor situation, but I'm just saying that in terms of reading national charts, reading things like a Neptune return or a Pluto return, these are the kind of things that we have to draw to for we can draw these lines of comparison for the historical precedent, right? There's something else I would like to point out as well. Just things that I noticed here, right? So Canada has at the 8 degrees of Cancer this perfect conjunction between Sun and Uranus, and if we were thinking about if Canada was a person, who would you compare Canada to, right? What kind of people come to mind that have Sun-Uranus conjunctions, right? Well, you don't have to go very far to think about this guy. You may have heard of him, Donald Trump, right? He's this guy who's been elected the American president for the second time. Donald Trump actually has a Sun-Uranus conjunction, but it's separate by an orb of 5 degrees, meaning it's not Uranus has a sort of quality of being rebellious, of being disruptive, of being revolutionary, all this kind of stuff. And, you could understand how a populist politician like Donald Trump, maybe with the Sun-Uranus conjunction, a solar figure, a leader who harnesses those Uranus energies in some way of the rowdy, disruptive populace, right? Now, what's interesting is that the similar dynamic is actually in the Canadian chart, but actually stronger because of the perfection of this in these two planets are perfectly conjunct in Cancer, and at the IC for those, the IC marks the bottom of the chart. So if you were to think about this, the IC is like, if the MC is the top, the very tall, high part of the heaven, the IC is the land underneath your feet. And the idea that one of the main thing contributing to this trade war, which is supposed to happen in March, 2 weeks from now, we're supposed to start entering into a trade war. One of the factors that was actually caught on a hot mic, right? That Justin Trudeau didn't mean to announce this, but it was captured on a hot mic. This is actually kind of Uranian if you think about it. The idea that something that you're talking about escapes despite your attempt to control the information, it leaks out there, right? That the idea of why Trump may be interested in annexing Canada may be because in the push to replace fossil fuels with green technology, that Canada, as well as Greenland, have substantial mineral deposits that are going to be necessary for the production of things like batteries and computer chips and all this kind of stuff. And that, of course, it would be much easier. It'd be the people who own the land are in an advantageous opportunity to profit off these minerals, should these minerals be subject to an increase in demand, right? And in Canada's natal chart, the mineral Uranus is an indicator for technology, for technological development, for all this kind of stuff like that. And with this Canadian chart, this Canadian national chart, it shows that the leadership, the sun, the sovereignty of the country, the leadership is very much tied into the land itself as being a resource for minerals that will be useful in the production of this new technology. And this is all has to do with the Sun-Uranus conjunction, right? And however, it's interesting. I was reading another astrologer's comments on this dynamic in the Canada's chart, and another astrologer. It's interesting because I've sort of clued into this fact that a lot of people associate Neptune with what would be considered left wing, right? As in communism, the communist revolution happening under a Saturn-Neptune conjunction, all this kind of stuff. And then I tend to associate Pluto with fascism, right? As in contrast. But what's interesting is that apparently other people are associating Uranus with a kind of right-wing, I don't know, like a tech bro libertarianism. Because Uranus obviously has to do with technology. It always obviously has to do with this disruptive influence of people like Elon Musk or like companies like Uber, disrupting old markets, or, in this sense, it could be this like disruption is like the disruption of the oil industry, right? That we had this, that you're going to have this change away from fossil fuels towards either electric vehicles or mass transit or more online, kind of stuff, more things to do with batteries, more things to do with electricity production. And that disruption, that kind of change and instability is often something which has been associated with business, with people who are looking for these moments of disruption, for opportunities to capitalize on it and make a whole bunch of money, right? And that opportunity to capitalize and make a whole bunch of money for yourself is not for liberating the people. It's not for liberating the masses. It's for you as a selfish individual to put yourself in a position, But what's interesting is that if you think about where some of the mythology from this originates, Richard Tarnas has always said that to understand the Uranus archetype, it's more helpful to talk about Prometheus, right? In the myth of Prometheus, Prometheus was a god who was, you have to understand there's something almost like a precursor to the Jesus Christ myth here, because Prometheus suffered for taking the fire from the gods, giving it to the humans. He was made to have an eagle eat his intestines for all of eternity. Like similar, kind of resonant with Jesus suffering on the cross almost, right? There's some kind of thing where, but Prometheus was already a god. He didn't need to do this for himself. He did this because he loved the people. He loved the masses. He wanted to basically take what the gods had for themselves and bring it to the humans so that the humans could participate in this whole divine experience, that they weren't just some sort of lowly slaves, that they were actually getting the juicy part of life, right? But the gods are pissed at Prometheus for doing this, and Prometheus was punished, right? But the thing is, there's something about this which is there's a certain, I don't see it, there's a certain tech bro mentality where it's like, are we really liberated because Elon Musk has gifted us the opportunity to drive an electric car, and now we have to either suffer in the trade war or have our territory as Canadians deterritorialized, and we're going to be, I think there's a dead giveaway that this is not going to happen. And not just, it is interesting though, the Neptune return of Canada. Canada is going to be undergoing a Neptune return, and there is some kind of precedent for conflict around this. If you look at our neighbor America, how it went for them when they had a Neptune return, right? There is some precedent, especially because this is Aries, the sign of war. This is also the first house, which if we are unable to resist these pressures Neptune stands for fusion. Are we just going to be fused with America, that we have no sense of autonomy, of independence, of individuality aside from the Americans? Or is this an opportunity for us to assert the spirit, the real dream of what Canada is as its own entity on an international stage, right? This is something that we might see with Neptune in Aries, the Neptune return, right? And I think there's also part of the reason, like what I was going to say is that there's some obvious thing why this isn't, for one thing, if you decode the language that they use to talk about this, right? That first of all, I've already talked about how obviously a subsidy and a deficit are not the same thing. You can also consider that if you play devil's advocate, let's say Canada does get annexed by the United States. Why would Canada become the 51st state? It doesn't make any sense. Canada has a number of different provinces, and all of these provinces are fairly large. And the whole idea of the United States in the first place is you have states which are united, right? So if Canada was to become part of America, then it's like by turning a country into a state, it wouldn't make any sense. You'd need to turn a province into a state, right? Now, of course, it would be like kind of like thinking about something like North and South Dakota, or North and South Carolina, right? Now, these are two separate states, but like why do you have these states split into North and South, right? Why don't you just have one state and just call it Carolina rather than having North and South Carolina? Why have North and South Dakota? It doesn't make any sense, right? But regardless, there are these divisions that, that define, let's say like British Columbia, where I live, and you could define that against Alberta. Very different places, right? There's a certain kind of identity of the, and this, I don't think this goes beyond whether we're part of Canada, part of America, or even if we separate and become our own country or something like that. There are these places that there's something about the spirit of the place that resists just getting lumped into everything, like fused into everything else. There's no boundary between BC and Alberta. There's a boundary between, you got these fucking big ass mountains, right? You got these mountains providing a bioregional boundary. And you've got this whole cultural attitude where BC and Alberta don't really get along. You've got a bunch of industrious oil barons, and then you got a bunch of like pot smoking yoga hippies, right? They're like, it's like oil. There's just very different attitudes between BC and Alberta, and there are interprovincial tensions, right? And we're like, the thing is, like, we're being under threat of annexation from somebody who doesn't even respect the boundaries between one province and another, and sees them as just one thing that's going to become the 51st state. And I think that the way, just expressing it that way, there's obviously a certain kind of a narcissistic kind of disrespect for the other country and how the other country defines itself, right? That all the way that we set up, how we define what is us versus you, is something that doesn't matter, that can just be bulldozed over and redefined. And I think there's something about, maybe with Neptune, there's a kind of, everything's just peace and love, man. It's all one anyways. Who cares, right? But there's some kind of thing, I think, with our Canadians' Neptune return, especially with Saturn here, Saturn and Neptune in Aries, we're going to have to redefine these boundaries. And what's interesting is that we're also going to be getting a Jupiter into Cancer, which Jupiter is going to be conjoining Canada's natal Sun, Uranus. It's going to be a Jupiter return for America at the same time. And there's a certain attitude of generosity and abundance and sharing and stuff like that that is going to be a benefic influence on all these transits, right? So I think there's some kind of, there's some kind of thing where is the wealth here of Canada here to support the people of Canada, or is it here just to be pillaged by the robber barons, whoever has the most power? And are we going to be able to defend our land, or basically use the increasing demand for these mineral deposits that are going to be vitally necessary for the advancements of future technology? Can we take these mineral deposits and leverage them and use them strategically in the upcoming trade war so that we can retain our national identity, which, as you can see if you take this thing about Neptune in Aries having a more, if you have Neptune in the first house, it tells you that the self-identity if you treat this chart as a person, it's going to be more naturally inclined to a Neptune way of relating to the world. And this could be a more of a sympathy to socialism, communism, all this kind of stuff. There is still a opportunity to profit off the disruptions, the changes, the new inventions, the new technologies by what's in the land with this Uranus sun in the fourth house. But still, the Canadian identity with this Neptune on the ascendant is very much like, we have an identity of we're not going to give up our public health care. We're not going to give up our socialist principles in the face of this basically a kind of a micro-fascist, neo-conservative pressure that a kind of a narcissistic disregard for boundaries that just wants to take everything and reappropriate it, and while disrespecting everybody, right? I think that is kind of what we're up against here. So, I don't know. These are just this is what's on my mind as we head into this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Tell your friends. And stay tuned for more.